The air in the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters was thick with a silence that felt heavier than the humid Tokyo summer of 1944. On a vast mahogany table, intelligence officers had carefully arranged a series of glossy reconnaissance photographs. Each image was a stark testament to a reality that the Japanese High Command had refused to believe was possible. The pictures showed ship after ship, a seemingly endless parade of new American aircraft carriers of the Essex class, their decks pristine, their hulls massive and imposing. Admiral Somu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the documents spread before him. The photographs were damning, but it was the accompanying numbers, the production schedules, the launch dates, the commissioning reports, that delivered the final, crushing blow. The figures simply did not compute, they defied all strategic logic and military precedent. In a single year, the United States had built and deployed more fleet and light carriers than the Imperial Japanese Navy had managed to sink since the war began. This was not a report of a battle lost or a campaign faltering. It was the cold, mathematical certainty of absolute defeat. In that silent room, surrounded by the evidence of an industrial miracle, the realization dawned with chilling clarity: the war was not being lost in the contested waters of the Pacific or the skies above the Mariana Islands, but in the sprawling, indefatigable factory complexes and shipyards thousands of miles across the ocean. This moment of dreadful epiphany was the culmination of a profound strategic miscalculation rooted in the very origins of the conflict. At the outset of the war, the Japanese High Command was confident that victory could be achieved through a series of swift, devastating, and decisive blows against the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The strategy was predicated on the belief that America, a nation perceived as soft and unwilling to endure a protracted and bloody conflict, would lose its will to fight after a few stunning defeats. This would allow Japan to solidify its vast new empire in Asia and the Pacific, ultimately forcing a negotiated peace that would cement its dominance. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant but troubled architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was one of the few who harbored deep reservations about this optimistic scenario. He famously warned the government with a chillingly accurate prophecy: "I can guarantee to run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have absolutely no confidence about the second and third years." His words, initially dismissed by many as overly cautious, proved to be tragically precise. By 1943, and certainly by 1944, the scenario he dreaded had become a terrifying reality. The Japanese Admiralty found itself confronting an unprecedented surge of American industrial might, a relentless torrent of steel and naval power that surpassed all their calculations and rendered their initial strategic assumptions utterly obsolete. While cinema would later popularize the dramatic phrase attributing to Yamamoto the fear of having awakened a sleeping giant, there is no definitive historical evidence that he ever spoke those exact words. The true, documented account of his state of mind is perhaps even more telling. In the immediate aftermath of the successful attack on Pearl Harbor, a day of supreme triumph for the Imperial Navy, Yamamoto did not celebrate. Instead, historical records indicate that he spent the day secluded in his cabin, immersed in obvious depression. His despair was not born of military failure, but of a deep and insightful understanding of the American character. He knew that attacking without a formal declaration of war would be viewed not as a clever strategic move, but as an act of profound treachery. He understood that this perceived betrayal would not cripple or intimidate the American people but would instead galvanize them, forging their isolationist sentiments into an unbreakable resolve for total victory. He had not merely crippled a fleet, he had unleashed a righteous fury, a national commitment to a war of attrition that he knew Japan, with its limited resources, could not possibly win. The giant was not just awake, it was enraged, and the consequences of that rage were only just beginning to take shape on the production lines of American industry. In the heady, triumphant days following the attack on Pearl Harbor, a wave of unrestrained optimism swept through the Imperial Japanese Navy. From the perspective of the Japanese High Command, the opening phase of the war had been an unparalleled success. The audacious surprise attack had effectively neutralized the core of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, leaving 8 American battleships sunk or crippled amidst the wreckage of Battleship Row. With the primary obstacle removed, the path to dominating the Pacific and Southeast Asia seemed wide open. The prevailing strategic assumption among Japanese admirals was that they had bought themselves a crucial window of time. They calculated that the United States, with its industrial base still on a peacetime footing, would require a minimum of 2 to 3 years to recover from such a devastating blow and rebuild its naval strength. This generous timeframe was considered more than sufficient for Japan to conquer its desired territories, establish an impenetrable defensive perimeter, and fortify its gains. The ultimate goal was not total conquest of the United States, but to inflict such a series of rapid, demoralizing defeats that Washington would be forced to the negotiating table, accepting a peace treaty that would permanently recognize Japan's new order in Asia. However, a fatal oversight lay at the heart of this strategy, a detail that, at the time, seemed minor but would prove to be decisive. The American aircraft carriers, the intended primary targets of the raid, had been at sea on December 7 and had escaped the inferno of Pearl Harbor untouched. These surviving flat tops would soon become the foundation of America's counteroffensive, the very instruments that would unravel Japan's grand design. This confidence was not based on wishful thinking alone, it was backed by hard numbers and a distinct qualitative edge. As of December 1941, Japan's naval aviation was the most formidable in the world, boasting a force of 10 aircraft carriers, including lighter-class vessels, against the 7 large carriers possessed by the United States. Furthermore, with the Western Allies forced to divide their naval assets between the Atlantic and Pacific theaters to contend with Nazi Germany, the effective force ratio in the Pacific was almost 2-to-1 in Japan's favor. This numerical superiority was amplified by a demonstrable advantage in quality. Japan's naval pilots were an elite corps of veterans, hardened by years of rigorous training and combat experience in the Second Sino-Japanese War. They were arguably the most skilled and experienced naval aviators on the planet. Their equipment was equally superb. The legendary Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighter dominated the skies, outperforming any Allied aircraft it encountered in the early stages of the war, while their torpedo bomber crews had demonstrated a lethal efficiency that instilled fear in every Allied sailor. This military confidence was dangerously bolstered by a profound cultural misreading of the adversary. A pervasive belief within the Japanese military and political establishment held that the United States was a decadent, materialistic society. They viewed it as a nation oriented toward comfort and consumption, lacking the martial spirit and national will, that Yamato Damashii, to endure the hardships of a prolonged war of attrition. This underestimation, rooted in cultural stereotypes and a fundamental misunderstanding of American psychology, led them to believe that the shock of Pearl Harbor would intimidate and demoralize the American public. In reality, the attack achieved the exact opposite. It acted as a powerful catalyst, instantly dissolving the prevailing isolationist sentiment that had kept America out of the war. The Day of Infamy consolidated American society, transforming a divided nation into a unified and unwavering force, driven by a collective resolve to fight for nothing less than the complete and unconditional surrender of its enemies. This illusion of invincibility was perhaps best embodied in the spring of 1942, as the core of Japan's striking power, the First Air Fleet, sortied from Tokyo Bay. The 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Zuikaku, and Shokaku, represented the beating heart of the empire's naval might. This was the peerless force that had shattered Pearl Harbor and then swept across the Pacific and Indian Oceans like a cleansing fire, sinking warships and devastating Allied bases with impunity. Aboard these ships, the sailors and airmen were filled with an unshakable belief in their own supremacy and the manifest destiny of their empire. There was no enemy they could not defeat, no ocean they could not conquer. No one among the cheering crews could yet know that in a few short weeks, 4 of these magnificent vessels would lie shattered on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, their names forever linked to a tiny atoll called Midway. The Battle of Midway, fought over 3 momentous days from June 4 to 6, 1942, was the devastating turning point of the Pacific War. In this single, catastrophic engagement, the strategic calculus of the conflict was irrevocably altered. Japan's seemingly unstoppable offensive momentum was not just halted, it was shattered. In the space of 72 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered a blow from which it would never truly recover. 4 of its finest heavy aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu the very heart of the Pearl Harbor strike force, were sent to the bottom of the ocean. They were joined by a heavy cruiser, and with them went 248 of their invaluable aircraft. But the most crippling loss was not measured in steel, but in human life. The fires at Midway consumed hundreds of Japan's most experienced and highly trained pilots, an elite cadre of warriors who represented an irreplaceable national asset. The United States, by contrast, suffered significant but far more manageable losses: the single aircraft carrier USS Yorktown Dash, an escorting destroyer, and 150 aircraft. Crucially, where Japan lost its veteran air crews forever, the majority of downed American pilots were rescued from the sea. The American Search and Rescue Service, operating with a level of efficiency far superior to its Japanese counterpart, ensured that its skilled aviators would live to fly and fight another day. On paper, the post-battle shift in naval power seemed significant but not yet fatal. After the losses at Midway, Japan was left with 1 heavy and 4 light carriers in its operational fleet, facing off against 3 heavy American carriers. However, these raw numbers failed to capture the true depth of the disaster for Japan. The Imperial Navy had entered the war with a corps of naval pilots that was, arguably, the best in the world. Each pilot was the product of a grueling, multi-year training program that forged them into masters of their craft. When these veterans perished in the flames of their carriers, Japan lost more than just men, it lost a generation of accumulated skill, combat wisdom, and institutional knowledge. The nation's pilot training pipeline was rigid and slow, utterly incapable of producing replacements at the speed or quality required to keep pace with its losses. Meanwhile, the United States was already ramping up a massive pilot training program designed to churn out thousands of new aviators. After Midway, the qualitative advantage in the air, once Japan's greatest strength, began to inexorably shift in favor of the Americans. The shock of the defeat was so profound that its full scale was not immediately understood, even by the Japanese command. A culture of honor and a reluctance to report failure led returning pilots to grossly exaggerate the damage they had inflicted on the American fleet, a common and ultimately self-defeating trait within the Japanese military. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, the commander of the ill-fated carrier strike force, was so overcome with shame that he and his wounded chief of staff attempted to commit ritual suicide. They were persuaded by junior officers to live on, to report the disaster to the high command. Others were not so restrained. The commander of the carrier, Hiryu Dash, the last of the 4 to sink after a valiant but doomed counterattack, chose to embrace the samurai code of Bushido Dash. Refusing all pleas to abandon his ship, he tied himself to the bridge and went down with his vessel, a final act of honor in the face of an unthinkable defeat. As one analysis aptly summarized the battle's true impact, the Japanese losses proved irreplaceable. From this moment on, they lost their advantage in the quality of their flight crews, lacking adequate replacements. The advantage in aerial combat began to pass to the Americans. For the first time, the illusion of Japanese invincibility had been broken, not by a single lucky shot, but by a decisive and calamitous failure from which there would be no recovery. While the Imperial Japanese Navy was still assessing its devastating losses at Midway, a revolution was taking place on the distant shores of the United States. A new and unprecedented shipbuilding program, operating on a scale never before seen in human history, was roaring to life. The driving force behind this miracle was not a traditional shipwright but an industrialist named Henry J. Kaiser, a man with no prior experience in constructing warships. Kaiser approached shipbuilding not as a bespoke craft but as a mass-production challenge, applying the revolutionary assembly line and modular construction techniques that had previously defined the American automobile industry. The time-honored tradition of riveting hulls plate by plate was replaced by the faster, stronger method of electric arc welding. Instead of the slow, sequential process of building a ship from the keel up on a slipway, Kaiser pioneered a system of parallel assembly. Entire sections of a ship, some weighing as much as 200 tons, were prefabricated in specialized workshops. These massive, complete modules were then transported to the slipway and fitted together like pieces of a giant construction set, dramatically accelerating the entire process. The first and most stunning demonstration of this new philosophy was the production of the humble Liberty ship, the workhorse cargo vessel of the Allied war effort. When the program began, the construction of a single Liberty ship took approximately 230 days. By the end of 1942, Kaiser's shipyards had slashed that time to an average of just 42 days. In November 1942, one of his shipyards staged a remarkable publicity event to showcase the system's ultimate potential, constructing the SS Robert E. Peary, from keel laying to launch in an astonishing 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Just 3 days after that, the ship was loaded with cargo and put to sea. While this was a propaganda stunt, deliberately staged with prefabricated components ready to go, the underlying reality was no less fantastic. By 1943, American shipyards were launching an average of 3 Liberty ships every single day. In total, 2,751 of these vessels were built, a record of mass production that will likely never be broken and a testament to an industrial capacity that could not be matched. These revolutionary techniques were not limited to simple freighters. They were soon adapted to produce the most complex naval vessels of the time, aircraft carriers. At Kaiser's shipyard in Vancouver, Washington, this process reached its zenith with the Casablanca-class escort carriers. Between April 1943 and May 1944, this single facility launched 50 of these Jeep carriers, a rate of nearly 1 carrier per week. Initial construction took around 9 months, but as the process was perfected, that time fell to just 3.5 months. 50 carriers from one shipyard in less than 2 years made the Casablanca class the most numerous series of aircraft carriers in history. Simultaneously, the massive fleet carriers of the Essex class were being built with similar, ever-increasing speed. The lead ship, USS Essex was laid down in April 1941 and commissioned in December 1942, a construction time of 20 months. But as the yards gained experience, the pace quickened. USS Lexington was completed in 17 months, and by the time USS Hancock and USS Ticonderoga were launched, the build time had been reduced to an incredible 15 months. By late 1943, America was commissioning a new fleet or light carrier almost every single month. A total of 24 Essex-class carriers were built, with 17 of them entering the fight before the war's end. Kaiser's genius was in reorganizing the very logic of construction. He explained his method in 1943, stating, "In traditional shipbuilding you cannot install the engine until the engine room is built. You cannot build the engine room until the hull is ready. Everything happens sequentially. My approach allows for parallel production." This meant that while one team of workers was welding the hull sections, another team in a separate facility would be assembling the entire engine and all its auxiliary systems into a single, complete module. When both parts were ready, a massive crane would simply lower the finished engine into the waiting engine room, a process that took a mere 8 hours instead of the 3 weeks required by traditional methods. Prefabricated sections like superstructures and conning towers were often assembled on their side or even upside down, allowing welders easier, gravity-assisted access to seams, which resulted in stronger and faster welds. Initially, the established, traditional shipbuilders viewed Kaiser's methods with contempt, dismissing them as reckless and predicting catastrophic failures. The statistics, however, told a different story. While over 20% of ships built at other yards were found to have serious defects, Kaiser's defect rate was less than 10%. Yet, the new welded hulls were not without their own problems. A significant weakness emerged in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, where the steel could become brittle. A number of ships, including 19 Liberty ships, suffered from catastrophic hull fractures and literally broke in half at sea. This was not a failure of the production concept itself but a materials science challenge. The problem was rigorously studied, and by 1942-43, it was solved through the introduction of improved grades of steel and structural reinforcements, turning a potential crisis into another lesson in rapid, wartime innovation. Behind the staggering production numbers and the engineering genius of men like Henry Kaiser, there was an equally revolutionary social transformation. The immense industrial surge in American shipbuilding was powered by a mobilized army of millions of workers, and a critical component of this army, comprising nearly a third of its total strength, was women. The iconic symbol of this profound shift was Rosie the Riveter, an allegorical figure who appeared on posters and in songs, her determined expression and rolled-up sleeves becoming a powerful call to action. She was the personification of a generation of American women who left their homes to take up demanding industrial jobs on the nation's assembly lines and shipyards, trading aprons for overalls to build the arsenal of democracy. The statistics underlying this transformation are staggering. Between 1940 and 1944, the number of women in the American workforce swelled from 12 million to 20 million, a remarkable increase of 57%. This new labor force was absolutely vital to the war effort, particularly in the burgeoning shipbuilding industry on the Pacific coast, where, by 1943, 3/5 of all female shipbuilders were employed. At Kaiser's massive shipyards in Richmond, California, women constituted a full third of the 90,000-strong workforce. At other yards, their proportion was even higher, sometimes reaching an astonishing 60%. These were not clerical or support roles, women were on the front lines of production, performing the same arduous and physically demanding jobs as men. They operated massive cranes, welded heavy steel plates in all-weather conditions, and mastered the pneumatic riveting guns used to fasten the hulls of warships and cargo vessels. This immense contribution was personified by individuals like Rosie the Riveters, a riveter who on June 8, 1943, set an incredible production record. Working on the wing of a bomber aircraft, she single-handedly drove 3,345 rivets during a single work shift, a feat of endurance and skill that earned her a personal letter of commendation from President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. To put her achievement in context, a single Liberty ship required approximately 150,000 rivets to complete, illustrating the monumental collective effort required. But this monumental effort came at a significant personal cost. The work was intensely dangerous, and the women who built the fleet faced constant hazards. Welders frequently suffered from corneal burns due to the intense ultraviolet radiation from the welding arc, a painful condition known as arc eye. First and second-degree burns from hot metal and sparks were a daily risk. The air in the cavernous workshops and enclosed ship hulls was often thick with toxic fumes from heavy metals like lead and asbestos, creating long-term health problems that would affect many for the rest of their lives. For the riveters, the work was punishing. The heavy pneumatic guns they wielded produced bone-jarring vibrations that led to chronic pain in their muscles and joints, a physical toll that they endured shift after grueling shift. A powerful snapshot of this era was captured in June 1943, at a shipyard in Richmond. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was present to christen and launch the escort carrier USS Casablanca — the lead ship of her class. A crowd of 75,000 spectators watched the ceremony, but among them were thousands of women still in their work clothes, their faces smudged with grease and grime. They were the ones who had built this ship. As the carrier slid into the water, these women knew its timeline with an intimate certainty. In just 3.5 months, this vessel would be in combat thousands of miles away. But there was no time for rest or prolonged celebration. Their eyes could already see the adjacent slipway, where the keel of the next aircraft carrier was already being laid. For them, the ceremony was just a brief pause in a relentless cycle. The conveyor belt never stopped. By the beginning of 1943, the initial confidence of the Japanese High Command had begun to erode, replaced by a creeping, almost surreal sense of dread. Intelligence reports, trickling in from agents stationed in neutral ports and gleaned from long-range reconnaissance, started to paint a picture of American industrial activity that bordered on the unbelievable. The numbers were so immense they seemed like pure fiction, a deliberate campaign of Allied propaganda designed to demoralize them. Admiral Yamamoto himself meticulously studied the dispatches. The reports claimed that American shipyards had delivered over 700 large merchant vessels in 1942 alone, and that the pace of production was not slowing but accelerating. This presented a horrifying strategic paradox. Japan's submarine and surface raider campaigns in the Pacific had been tactically successful, sinking approximately 1.5 million tons of Allied merchant shipping. By any traditional military calculation, such losses should have been a devastating, potentially crippling blow to the enemy's logistical capacity. Yet America was not just compensating for these losses, it was expanding its merchant marine and naval fleets at a rate that made Japan's attrition efforts utterly futile. They were punching holes in a bucket that was being filled by a fire hose. The true shock, however, came from the reports on warship construction. As one high-ranking admiral, Somu Toyota, admitted in a post-war interrogation, the Japanese command was blindsided not by the existence of America's new carriers, but by the velocity at which they were being produced and deployed. "We knew that they were building Essex-class carriers," Toyota stated. "We received reports of their keel layings and their launchings, but we believed that the reports were exaggerated or that the ships would require many long months of crew training and workups before they could become combat-ready." The fatal flaw in their analysis was this assumption that the American logistical and training pipeline operated on the same timeline as their own. The speed with which these powerful new American carriers transitioned from their commissioning ceremonies directly to active combat operations in the Pacific was a development that, in Toyota's words, shocked the Japanese planners. They were facing an enemy who could not only build fleets on an assembly line but could also man them and send them into battle with terrifying efficiency. This daunting, horrifying reality was given its most brutal and undeniable confirmation in the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19 to 20, 1944. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the largest Japanese fleet assembled in 2 years, steamed into battle with 9 aircraft carriers and 430 aircraft. It was a formidable force, intended to strike a decisive blow. But waiting for him was an American task force of a scale he could barely comprehend, 15 carriers, including 7 of the new heavy Essex-class flat-tops and 8 powerful light carriers. The result was not a battle, it was a massacre. Over 2 days, the Japanese lost 3 of their precious carriers and an astounding 600 aircraft, including land-based planes. The Americans lost only 123 aircraft and suffered only minor damage to a single battleship. The new generation of Japanese pilots, rushed through inadequate training programs, were so hopelessly outmatched by the well-trained American aviators and their superior Hellcat fighters that the American pilots grimly nicknamed the lopsided aerial combat the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This industrial and training disparity was perfectly encapsulated by a stark comparison from earlier in the war. After the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the heavily damaged American carrier USS Yorktown was patched up and made battle-ready at Pearl Harbor in just 72 hours, allowing it to play a pivotal role at Midway. For the Japanese Navy, a comparable repair job would have required a minimum of 11 weeks. This was the industrial gap in microcosm. Admiral Ozawa, who survived the war, confessed the profound sense of hopelessness that overcame him during that battle. "I realized in the Philippine Sea that we had lost the war," he stated in a post-war debriefing. Not because of tactics, not because of courage, because of mathematics. They were losing ships and replacing them with new ones faster than we could sink them, and all the while they were still increasing the total size of their fleet. This catastrophic outcome was compounded by a systemic flaw within the Japanese military culture. Ozawa had based his entire battle plan on inaccurate reports from his own returning pilots, who consistently and vastly exaggerated the damage they had inflicted on the enemy, claiming to have sunk or crippled multiple American carriers when, in fact, not a single one had been lost. The Japanese command was fighting a war based on illusions, and in the skies over the Marianas, those illusions were incinerated by the crushing, mathematical reality of American power. By October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a shadow of its former self, a cornered and desperate force. In a final, monumental gamble, the High Command initiated its last large-scale operation of the war, a complex and audacious plan to disrupt the American landings in the Philippines. Admiral Somu Toyota, now leading the combined fleet, was under no illusions about the nature of the mission. He understood with stark clarity that he was sending his remaining ships into a near-certain suicide attack. Yet, facing a crippling lack of fuel that would soon render the fleet inert and useless in port anyway, he reasoned that the slim possibility of gain outweighed the risk of losing the fleet. If the Imperial Navy was to die, it would die in a blaze of battle rather than rusting at anchor. This was to be its final, desperate charge. The resulting engagement, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, raged from October 23 to 26, 1944. It was the largest naval battle in the Second World War, and arguably in all of history, involving a staggering total of over 200,000 sailors and airmen across both fleets. When the smoke cleared, the scale of the Japanese defeat was absolute. The Imperial Navy lost 3 battleships, 1 heavy fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The human cost was just as catastrophic, with 10,000 Japanese sailors killed. In contrast, the United States, while bloodied, suffered manageable losses, 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, and several smaller vessels, with a total of 3,000 men lost. After this crushing blow, the Imperial Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist as a coherent, offensive fighting force. A little-known and deeply symbolic element of the Japanese battle plan revealed the full extent of their desperation. By October 1944, Japan still possessed several aircraft carriers, but it had almost no experienced pilots left to fly from their decks. The once feared carrier arm was now a hollow force. In the battle plan for Leyte, Admiral Ozawa was given command of a northern force containing 4 of these carriers. Their mission was not to attack, but to serve purely as bait. They were to sail openly, acting as a conspicuous and tempting target to lure the main American carrier fleet under Admiral Halsey away from the landing beaches. This represented the ultimate, humiliating degradation of Japan's premier weapon system. The aircraft carrier, once the proud centerpiece and striking fist of the fleet, was now reduced to a sacrificial pawn, its only purpose to die in order to create a diversion. While this decoy force drew off the American capital ships, the true attack was to be carried out by powerful surface forces of battleships and cruisers, which would sneak through the Central Straits to fall upon the vulnerable American transport and amphibious ships. The climax of this sprawling battle came in a chaotic and dramatic encounter off the island of Samar on October 25. A small group of slow American escort carriers and their screening destroyers, completely unaware of the danger, suddenly found themselves facing the main Japanese striking force commanded by Admiral Takeo Kurita aboard the super battleship Yamato. From a distance of 15 miles, the massive shells from Japanese heavy cruisers began to rain down around the small, thin-skinned jeep carriers, which maneuvered desperately to escape. It seemed their fate was sealed. They were hopelessly outgunned by battleships and cruisers capable of crushing them with ease. In a moment of incredible bravery, the American escorting destroyers and destroyer escorts turned and charged directly at the vastly superior Japanese fleet, launching a suicidal torpedo and gunnery attack to distract the enemy and buy time for their carriers. Aircraft from the escort carriers, armed with whatever munitions they had, rose to join the desperate fight, turning the battle into a maelstrom of smoke, explosions, and confusion. Amidst this chaos, Admiral Kurita, while maneuvering the Yamato to evade torpedoes, lost tactical cohesion and situational awareness. Critically, he became convinced that he was engaged with the main American fast carrier fleet, not a small, unsupported group of escort ships. Believing the odds were insurmountable, he made a fateful decision. He broke off the attack and ordered his powerful fleet to retreat, letting the ultimate prize slip through his fingers. The Japanese had missed their best chance to inflict a devastating blow, a failure born from the fog of a battle they had, for a fleeting moment, completely dominated. As former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo would later state before the War Crimes Tribunal, in an admission that went to the heart of Japan's defeat, we insufficiently understood American potential. By the close of 1944, the gap in industrial power between the United States and Japan had ceased to be a mere strategic disadvantage, it had become an absolute and unbridgeable chasm. The war was no longer being decided by tactics, bravery, or even grand strategy. It was being decided by the cold, brutal, and relentless logic of arithmetic. Japan was not simply being outfought, it was being systematically crushed, buried under the sheer weight of an industrial machine whose productive capacity was an estimated 10 to 15 times greater than its own. The final phase of the war was a grim exercise in demonstrating this overwhelming disparity, a lesson taught in spreadsheets and production schedules as much as on the battlefield. The statistics from the war years paint a stark and devastating picture of this industrial mismatch. In the critical category of aircraft carriers, the United States built or converted an astonishing 141 vessels of all types between 1941 and 1945. Japan, over the same period, managed to produce just 17. In the air, the difference was just as pronounced. American factories turned out 324,750 military aircraft, while Japan's entire war production amounted to 76,320. The lifeblood of modern warfare, oil, was perhaps the most lopsided statistic of all. The United States had access to 151 times more petroleum than Japan did. This industrial dominance had a direct and catastrophic impact on the quality of Japanese fighting men. By 1945, an American naval aviator entering combat would have received, on average, 600 hours of flight training, making them a competent and confident professional. Their Japanese counterpart, rushed to the front lines due to desperate shortages of fuel, aircraft, and time, was lucky to have between 40 and 70 hours of training, barely enough to master the basics of flight, let alone the complexities of aerial combat. To grasp the sheer scale of the American effort, one need only consider that a single Ford Motor Company factory in Detroit employed more workers than the entire Japanese aviation industry combined. By the end of the war, the U.S. Navy had grown so colossally that it was larger than the combined fleets of all other nations in the world. So immense was the production that some late-war aircraft carriers were completed, commissioned, and immediately put into storage, their service not even required to secure victory. This overwhelming reality was something the Japanese high command struggled, and ultimately failed, to comprehend. A post-war analysis by the U.S. Naval Analysis Division, based on interrogations of high-ranking Japanese officers, concluded that the failure was not in the gathering of intelligence, but in strategic analysis. Japanese intelligence provided accurate information about U.S. industrial production. But we failed to understand that the American achievements in shipbuilding represented systematic innovations in maritime production, and not temporary advantages. They had the numbers, but the numbers were so far outside their own frame of reference that they seemed impossible. There was a systemic refusal to believe the data their own spies were providing. When intelligence reports first arrived stating that Henry Kaiser's shipyards had built a Liberty ship in just 4 days, the Japanese admirals dismissed it as absurd American propaganda and ordered their agents to re-verify the information. Even when confronted with accurate figures on the number of Essex-class carriers being launched, they found it difficult to accept. Their own engineers insisted that, based on their experience, it was physically impossible to construct such a complex warship in less than 30 months. The fact that the Americans were doing it in 15 was not just a strategic problem, it was an intellectual impossibility they could not process. This complete industrial collapse was the direct catalyst for one of the most desperate and infamous tactics of the war, the kamikaze. By late 1944, Japan could no longer hope to compete conventionally. With a catastrophic lack of fuel, a shortage of modern aircraft, and no time to adequately train new pilots, the traditional aerial engagement had become a death sentence with little chance of inflicting meaningful damage on the enemy. The special attack units were a horrifyingly pragmatic solution to this dilemma. The logic was grim: if a novice pilot in an outdated plane was almost certain to be shot down by superior American aircraft and pilots, then his life and his machine should be expended in a way that guaranteed at least some chance of a result. His plane would become a guided missile. The rise of the kamikaze was not merely an expression of a unique warrior code, it was the final, desperate act of a nation whose industrial capacity had been utterly and completely vanquished. The Pacific War, for all its ferocious battles and acts of individual heroism, was ultimately not won or lost on the blood-soaked beaches of remote islands or in the contested waters of the vast ocean. It was decided thousands of miles away from the front lines, in the sprawling, clamorous factory floors and shipyards of the United States. The unyielding courage and formidable skill of the Japanese sailor and pilot, while undeniable, were ultimately rendered irrelevant. They were pitted against an adversary whose industrial supremacy was so absolute that it could absorb devastating losses and replenish them with a speed that defied belief, all while continuing to expand its already overwhelming power. The war was a contest of attrition that Japan was mathematically doomed to lose from the very beginning. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had seen this truth with painful clarity even before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, but his prophetic warnings were tragically ignored by a military leadership blinded by visions of a swift, decisive victory. By 1944, when the grim reality of America's industrial might could no longer be denied or misinterpreted, the Japanese admirals finally understood his fears. The realization came, but it came far too late. The gears of the American industrial machine were already turning at full speed, and there was nothing that could stop them. In a stark post-war admission that encapsulated the entirety of Japan's strategic failure, Admiral Somu Toyota confessed, Japan's strategy was, from the outset, flawed. We planned for a war of attrition against a country whose industrial potential exceeded our own by a factor of 10. It was suicide. His words serve as a final, damning verdict on a campaign built on a foundation of profound miscalculation. The Japanese leadership had fundamentally misunderstood not only the industrial capacity of the United States but also the unifying power of its democratic society when provoked. They had awakened a giant, not just a military one, but an industrial and societal one that, once fully aroused, was simply unstoppable. In one of the great and poignant ironies of 20th century history, the very engine of destruction that annihilated the Japanese Empire would ultimately provide the blueprint for its rebirth. After the war, many of the same Japanese officers and engineers who had been interrogated by their American counterparts were granted a first-hand look at the factories and shipyards that had defeated them. They studied the revolutionary methods of mass production, modular construction, and logistical efficiency that had seemed so impossible to them just a few years earlier. They took these lessons back to their devastated homeland, and these principles, the same ones that built the Essex-class carriers and the Liberty ships, became a cornerstone of the post-war Japanese economic miracle. The enemy's greatest weapon, the power of production, was transformed into an ally's greatest strength, forging a new relationship built not on the tools of destruction, but on the principles of creation. This entire epic of industrial warfare and fatal miscalculation is perhaps best captured in a final, quiet scene. In the autumn of 1945, in a drab interrogation room in occupied Tokyo, former Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, the man who had led Japan's carriers in their final, disastrous battles, sat before an officer from the U.S. Naval Analysis Division. On the table between them lay the evidence of his nation's defeat, glossy photographs of Kaiser's shipyards bustling with activity, stark graphs charting the exponential growth of American production, and long, meticulous lists of the ships that had been launched month after month. Ozawa studied the documents in a heavy silence, the full, crushing weight of the truth settling upon him. After a long moment, he looked up at the American officer, his voice devoid of anger or defiance, filled only with a weary sense of revelation. "We never had a chance, did we?" he asked, not as a warrior, but as a man finally confronting an undeniable force of nature. The American officer simply nodded. "You were fighting a country that could build ships faster than you could sink them," he replied. "It was mathematics, Admiral. Just mathematics.